Life of an American Soldier by Miles, Nick, Dylan, and Jack. Our subtopics are Stories from the Front, Women who Served During Vietnam, Returning Home, Life as a POW/MIA.
Stories from the front lines of the Vietnam War. This is the story of Sergeant Charles G. Richardson, who served from 1967 to 1968. For security reasons, Sergeant Richardson and his men were unable to know where they were going and where they would be fighting while being transported by helicopter. When he and his men hit the ground, they instantly started to dig foxholes and get ready for the long nights when they were unable to know when or where the enemy would be attacking from. A foxhole is a hole dug in the ground, in which a soldier sits in and is protected from the sides, the top, to shoot from this position. When on night watch, your job is to overlook the whole base and make sure that there is no movement outside of the perimeter. One night, Sergeant Richardson spotted activity outside the perimeter. It was 5 Vietnamese soldiers setting up mortar attacks on their base. Before the U.S. soldiers were able to put on their gear and become ready for battle, the North Vietnamese men began showering their base with mortars. During this raid, the soldiers were not able to see into the dark because they did not have time to put on their night vision. So Charles Richardson was into the dark to shoot in hopes of hitting some enemy soldiers. During this battle, a grenade was thrown into Sergeant Richardson's foxhole, and he was unable to get out before the grenade blew up. He was unconscious for 5 days, and medics thought he was dead, so they didn't even try to operate on him. Once he woke up, he was flown to where he would be operated on, and he recovered very well. In 1968, Sergeant Richardson would receive a Purple Heart for his military merit. Purple Hearts are awarded to anyone who is wounded or killed in action against any enemy of the United States, or as a result of an act of any such enemy or opposed armed forces. Later, Sergeant Richardson would do an interview on his experiences in war. He was quoted saying, "I do not like war, but I do like my freedom. It is worth the sacrifice that we have to make."
Women's roles in the Vietnam War. Women have been a part of every single war the U.S. has ever been involved in. Ever since the Revolutionary War, they have helped provide medical help to the injured. They have cooked for the armies and cleaned uniforms, and now today fight side by side with men in the war. The reason for becoming a nurse varied on the person. The two main causes for a woman wanting to become a nurse during the Vietnam War. The first was money. It did not require college education and hardly any preparation, and easy money to some. The second reason some women joined was because of the sense of accomplishment, and some didn't feel satisfied with their daily lives. The training of nurses was normally quite limited, and most nurses did not require a very long training. Experts say that about 60% of nurses who arrived in Vietnam had less than 2 years of medical training, and of that 60%, most had less than 6 months. Also, when the women trained, they were taught how to use guns, but when they got to Vietnam, they were never allowed to fire them. Women were so crucial in the Vietnam War for 2 reasons. The first reason is because the military technology had come so far that with napalm, so many more soldiers were getting injured. And because of helicopters, many men could get to hospitals much faster than they ever could before, causing way more people to just get injured when in the past they most likely would have died, making more nurses that much more useful. besides the obvious challenges women faced by seeing the gruesome effects war could have on men, they also had some challenges with money. Some women went into prostitution to help better themselves by making more money. Also, further into the war, women started going into the battlefield so they could treat men quicker. They saw many things in war that later caused them to be sent home because of the graphic images they saw.
After America's loss, a common misinterpretation circulated that the soldiers who fought in Vietnam did not meet the succession of their predecessors from World War II and the Korean War. Soldiers encountered hostility and negligence from protesters. Many thought the cruelest aspect of the war was the treatment of the returning soldiers. Soldiers were portrayed to the public as baby killers, psychos, drug addicts, and warmongers. Many soldiers were seen at airports being confronted by protesters, carrying signs that were used to attack the soldiers. Multiple protesters even threw urine at the veterans. In some instances, soldiers were refused service in restaurants. Movies and television shows began illustrating returning soldiers as deranged monsters even before the war ended. One famous quote made by General Wien is, "America should have been proud of them from the start, for they were a remarkable group of young men and women." This quote shows how the soldiers were unnecessarily mistreated. Life as a POW/MIA. What do they mean? Well, a POW is a prisoner of war, while an MIA is missing in action, both war terms. Reasons why the North Vietnamese took prisoners of war? Well, they thought as the Americans as war criminals, who had committed crimes against the North Vietnamese people in the course of an illegal war of aggression, that therefore the American prisoners were not entitled to any privileges and rights granted to prisoners of war. There are many, many war camps, some that may not be showed up on this map, nor the next, because they're so discreet. The Alcatraz was the most intense, but all their war camps were centralized in the city of Han Dui. Conditions of the camps. They're awful. The shacks that the prisoners were imprisoned in only had roofs of straw, and no walls but bamboo. Guards standing outside ready to shoot if anyone tried to escape. And the mosquitoes bit every inch of your body and caused you to get diseases. And the feces were laying left and right, causing you to get sick, throw up, and get even more ill. And soldiers were tortured by putting into boxes 4x4 and begged for mercy. The soldiers who were imprisoned at these camps were starved, given very little food, given just breadcrumbs. They were beaten, they were shot, they were waterboarded, and sometimes even executed in front of their peers to show an example of what could happen if you did rebel. Soldiers who were in the Vietnam War and were imprisoned as POWs, aka prisoners of war, were imprisoned up to 8 years as a maximum. Prisoners of war were either pilots that were shot down and captured, or men who were fighting on the front line and were shot, wounded, but taken as prisoners of war, or even Navy, who happened to have their boat sunken, but they were stranded. The North Vietnamese had a ceasefire in 1973, and the 579 POWs were freed. The Operation Homecoming happened in February and March of 1973. It was a great day for all those who were freed, and a great day for America.
In conclusion, the life of a soldier in the Vietnam War was a rough time, and both women and men both contributed to the war in many ways, even if they weren't on the battlefront. The front lines were a hard time for those who served, and felt they were being watched about their every movement by the Viet Congs. And also, the women helped as nurses and organization leaders and played a big role in the war. The men who were coming home seemed like there should be a time of rejoice, yet they were raided by anti-war protesters. And finally, the men who went missing and were imprisoned by the enemy lived one of the hardest lives in the war because they were being brutalized and were always in fear of losing their life.